Chapter 48. While I adjusted quickly to the routine of school, life at home inside the church was not without unpleasant surprises and difficulties. The church had been built on a small rise called Fenghuangshan, Phoenix Mountain. It was surrounded by apartment buildings. A single public latrine in the neighborhood was shared by nearly 200 families. It was a 5-minute walk uphill from the church to the latrine. Our only source for fresh water was a single faucet outside the church. The water did not flow on a regular basis. Some days and some hours there was water. Some days there was not. Often there was so little pressure that the water merely dripped from the faucet. One of our neighbors in the church was a low-ranking cadre who desperately wanted to be promoted. He was 50 years old and extremely thin. He looked like a walking skeleton. His cheeks were sunken. His skin was shallow. His hair was thin and white. For years he'd striven to rise within the party, but something had held him back. We were cautioned by our neighbors that in order to ingratiate himself to other party members, he had to become a sneak and an informant. From the day we moved in, he took a special interest in my parents. We often entertained visitors. The cadre was always curious about them. He intercepted them when they arrived or left, and struck up an awkward conversation. He asked their names, their occupations, and the nature of their business with us. Then he hurried back to his apartment to write a meticulous report for higher party cadres. He could also listen in on our conversations inside the church. The church was designed for good acoustics and not for privacy. Whenever anyone even expelled gas in one of the units, we all heard it and giggled. The cadre seemed tireless and was alert 24 hours a day. His copious detailed reports went into my father's files, and those files grew thick with his observations and suspicions. We learned of his activities because one afternoon, when he was rushing off to a party meeting carrying a thick sheaf of papers, a page from a report came loose and fluttered to rest a few steps from our front door. I found it when I returned from school. I saw the names of my parents and a list of the hours of the day and a summary of their activities and conversations. I gave it to my father. He read it. He showed it to Mama. They were unsure what to do with it. They didn't want to be caught with it because they would doubtless be accused of theft. So they tore it into small pieces and burned it in our stove. Later that day, I saw the man lurking outside the church, head down, scanning the ground for something. He looked up at me and scowled. I smiled and went back inside to do my homework. While the cadre was a disconcerting annoyance, the Chen family who lived next to us was never a threat. The father was employed in the university barber shop. The mother worked at Wuhu textile factory. They had 3 children. The oldest, Yuan Yu, was the one I'd heard crying through the reed wall. Night after night, we would whisper to each other through the wall until someone in the building shouted for us to shut up. She attended my school where she was 1 grade ahead of me. We became fast friends. She was about my size, a very pretty girl, with small eyes, full lips, and fair skin with freckles. We each had 2 brothers. We got up at the same time every morning. Whoever awakened first tapped on the mat softly to awaken the other. Then we dressed and grabbed a basket for grocery shopping and walked to the market together. The government market was cheaper than the black market, but the quality of the food was bad and was rationed. Most of the time, we went to the government market. There was always a long line. We stood in line together, and while we waited, we talked and combed each other's hair. The first morning we walked to the market, Yuan Yu leaned close to me and whispered, "Do you see him?" "See who?" I asked, since hundreds of other early shoppers surrounded us in the street. "Our crazy neighbor. He's following us." I looked back, but noticed nothing out of the ordinary. "I don't see him," I said. A moment later, Yuan Yu turned quickly and then said, "He hides sometimes. When he thinks you know he's there. Wait for a minute and then look again." I did as she said, and I saw him. A strange figure darting back and forth to conceal himself from us. Our eyes met for a moment before he crouched behind a group of pedestrians. He was a young man. His hair was tousled. His shirt was fastened only a single button, and he had a silly, guilty grin on his face. "I think I saw him," I said. "Who is he? What is he doing?" "He's a lunatic," she answered. "His family lives in the first apartment at the very front of the church. His father is the Snoopy cadre." "Is he dangerous?" I asked. "I don't think so," she said. "Just crazy. He follows me every day. Sometimes he walks close behind me and runs away if I turn around. Sometimes he stays at a distance and hides behind trees and buildings." "Why?" "I don't know. I told my mother. She told me to ignore him. If I complained to someone else, I'd probably get into trouble because of his cadre father." By the time we got to the market, he was gone. "He's kind of scary," I said as we stood in line. "How did he get that way?" "People say he was a student at the university," she said. "His parents spent a lot of money giving favors to the authorities to admit him to school. They finally succeeded, and because he's over 6 feet tall and not very bright, the university put him in the PE department to play basketball. There he met a tall, athletic girl, and he fell in love with her. She was a student in the art and music department. People said she was one of the most beautiful girls in the university. I never saw her, so I can't say. But they also said many boys had crushes on her. She got a lot of attention. She would not talk to him, but he became more and more obsessed with her. He sent her letters and tried to talk to her, but she ignored him. Eventually, he became so desperate that something in him snapped and he went crazy. He stopped going to school and he began walking around talking to himself all the time. He became strange. Sometimes, when I'm at home, I can hear him talking to his parents like a normal person, I said. But he is not normal, Yuanyu said. Believe me, he is not. He's crazy. After that, I discovered him following me several times. Sometimes he'd walk only a few inches behind me. If I looked back at him, he'd either glare defiantly at me or stop and look at the ground sheepishly. Sometimes he seemed to want to threaten me, and other times he seemed to be threatened by me. When I told my mother about him, all she did was to caution me to stay away from him because his parents wielded political influence. He had furious temperamental outbursts interrupted by long periods of nearly catatonic silence. He had good and bad days. On good days, he sat outside the church, unmoving and expressionless. On bad days, he howled and screamed and pounded on the walls. One morning after shopping, I walked to the public latrine. There were 2 rooms in the facility, one for men and the other for women. On the women's side were 2 rows of holes in the floor. No dividers separated them. I had lowered my trousers and squatted over one of the holes when he suddenly walked in and squatted over the hole opposite me. He leered at me with a big, mischievous idiot's grin. I pulled up my trousers and ran home. As I ran, I could hear his footsteps and his breathing close behind me. I hurried into our apartment and slammed the door behind me. I was trembling and out of breath and feared he might burst through the door. "What's wrong?" Mama asked. I found a piece of paper and wrote down what had happened. I was afraid if I spoke that the boy's father would overhear me. Mama read my words and pursed her lips and nodded. She opened the door a crack to see if he was outside. But he was gone. The boy became even crazier after that. One morning, he took his family's full night bucket and flung it against our door. We jumped when we heard the loud clatter. Moments later, we smelled the result of his fury. We were afraid to look outside. We heard him scream, "Damned rightists! We know what you are up to. This is only the beginning. The war has just begun." We stared at one another in dismay and fear as he revved. It reminded me of the Red Guards in Hefei. I was afraid that everything was coming back to destroy us. But we weren't his only targets. He was indiscriminate in his hate. He wandered around at all hours, pestering and accusing people. One evening, he walked away and didn't return. His parents looked for him most of the night, and in the morning filed a missing persons report. He didn't appear the next day or the next. He never came back. We were relieved by his disappearance, but we dared not express such feelings. On the way to school one morning, about a week after his disappearance, Yuan Yiyu stopped and turned around to look at the people walking far behind us. "I can't believe he's really gone," she said. We resumed our walk, and she told me how happy she was that the boy was gone. "Me too," I said. "I wonder what happened to him." "Why wonder?" she asked and laughed. "When something good happens, never ask why." Yuan Yu and I did nearly everything together. We walked back and forth to school, except when I had Communist Youth League meetings. She was not a member of the group. We carried our family laundry to the water faucet and sat on small stools and did the family wash while we chattered. There was a big tree in front of the church where we hung the clothes to dry. We climbed high into the branches when we were finished hanging the clothes and let our feet dangle and watch the world below us. One afternoon, while we were sitting in the tree, several policemen appeared and ordered everyone off the street. "Go inside and close your doors, and don't come out again until we tell you to," they shouted. A man asked, "What's happening? Is something wrong?" "A foreign dignitary is visiting Wuhu," a policeman answered. "He's come all the way from the United States. We don't want him to be bothered, so just get inside and stop asking questions." Yuan Yu and I stayed very still, and the policeman didn't see us. We remained safe in our perch while everyone else disappeared into their dwellings. 2 policemen stationed themselves near the base of our tree. It became very quiet on the street. We could hear the policemen talking. "Who is the dignitary?" one asked the other. "A famous physicist." "He's Chinese, but he lives in America," the other answered. "Famous? For what? The first asked. He won a Nobel Prize, came the reply. Didn't you read that in the People's Daily? What's his name? The first asked. Yang Zhenning, he answered. But this is hard to believe. Another Chinese physicist won it with him. 2 Chinese. Li Zhendao is the name of the other one. He also lives in America. When I heard the name of Li Zhendao, my mouth dropped open and my eyes widened. Yuan Yu noticed my surprise but remained silent. A line of police cars appeared with their lights flashing. Behind them was a black limousine, the biggest car I'd ever seen. The dark curtains in the windows were drawn shut. Behind the limousine were more police cars. They rushed past below us, and the 2 policemen strained to look inside the limousine. Moments after the motorcade had passed, the policemen walked away. People soon emerged from their living quarters, and the street came alive again. I scrambled down the street with Yuan Yu. You won't believe this, but we have a trunk in our place with Li Zhendao's name written on it, I told her breathlessly. And he wrote it himself. Really? She exclaimed. He was my papa's classmate in America a long time ago, I said. He helped Papa pack for his trip back to China. I ran home and found Papa sitting at a table reading. Papa, Papa, I whispered, restraining my excitement. Didn't you see who's here? Who? He asked. Yang Zhenning. And the policeman said that he's the friend of Li Zhendao. Papa's face paled. Papa, they said he is an important man now. They're both important and famous. My dear old friend, Papa murmured in disbelief. Here? Yes, I saw the limousine. Papa's eyes filled with tears. Here? In Wuhu? Now? Yes, I said, with policemen guarding him. Papa smiled a sad smile and held his head in his hands and said nothing more. End of chapter 48. Chapter 49. Nearly every night I heard Yuan Yu's father beat and berate her. He blamed her for anything that went wrong in the house. Even when her brothers didn't do as well in school as he expected, he blamed Yuan Yu. When he was finished, her mother often complained. Yuan Yu lay next to the wall and cried, and I could hear her only inches away from me. The sound clawed at my heart. I asked her why her parents behaved that way. She answered very simply, because they hate me. Why? I wish I knew, she said. Sometimes I think I'm adopted, and that's why they hate me. I think maybe someone gave me to them, maybe during the famine, and now they regret it. Maybe I have a real mother somewhere else. Maybe she misses me. I wish I could find her. Why would you say that, Yuanyu? Because everyone else in my family has big eyes and no freckles. Haven't you noticed? I have narrow eyes and freckles. I don't look like anyone else in the family. How can this be, Yimao? I don't know, I told her. Maybe that's why they hate me, she said. There's no other reason. I cook and I shop and I clean and I do the laundry, and they hate me. Like me, Yuanyu received straight A's in school, but this didn't impress her parents. They were concerned only with how her brothers did. Each night, I heard the shouting, the criticism, even the beating, and her pleas. Sometimes, when we met in the morning, I noticed that her eyes were red and her arms and faces were bruised. She asked to borrow my long-sleeved shirt to hide her bruises. I felt so sorry for her, but there was nothing I could do. As the school year drew to a close, she told me wistfully that she could hardly wait to graduate and get away from her home. I'll miss you terribly, Yimao, she said. I'll miss you too, Yuanyu, I assured her. But there is nobody else I will miss. Promise me, I said, that after you graduate and go away, promise me that you will write to me whenever you can. I will, she said. Will you write to me too? Every week, Yuanyu, I promise. That summer, Yuanyu was sent to work in the production and construction corps in the countryside. It was made of educated youths who were all high school graduates. She wrote a letter to me once each month, telling me that what her life was like there. It's hard work, Yimao, she wrote, and sometimes I get very tired, but nobody beats me. I'm glad I'm here. I miss you very much. I wrote back to her immediately, describing school and my friends and activities, and in every letter I told her that I missed her too and wished she lived closer. After several months, the tone of her letters changed. She told me that the boys in the production and construction corps liked her. They come from all over China, she said, and there are several of them who like me and talk to me after work and even help me on the job to make my life easier. I'm liking it more and more here, Yimao. Her letters came less often, and in the spring they stopped. I wrote a half-dozen letters to her after that, but there was no response. I stopped writing and waited and hoped for the day she'd come home and we could sit in the tree together again and she could tell me stories about her life in the countryside. I planned to remind her that she'd broken her promise to write to me. But before I made her sad, I'd also tell her I forgive her and that my feelings about her had never changed. Our educational curriculum was organized around the principle of Mao's open-door schooling. The great helmsman dictated that all students must not merely learn academic subjects in the classroom, but also learn from workers, peasants, and soldiers. Central to the fulfillment of Mao's decree was our assignment to work 4 weeks at a time in local factories. My first assignment was to a large popsicle factory on the outskirts of the city. Old women and children sold the popsicles on the street. They carried little wooden boxes and banged on them with a small block of wood, proclaiming, "Milk flavor, bean flavor, banana flavor, 3 fen, 4 fen, 5 fen." Popsicles were a special treat, a rare, affordable luxury. So when I learned I had been assigned to the popsicle factory, I was excited. I imagined that when I worked there, I'd be able to eat all the popsicles I wanted. The factory supervisor was a middle-aged woman who wore baggy blue overalls and a military-style cap. 20 of us were assigned to her facility. She ordered the boys to work with master worker Sun and the girls with master worker Wang. There were 8 girls in my group. Master worker Wang took us to a large room with 3 long tables placed end to end in the middle. She dragged in a big bamboo basket filled with red beans and spread them out evenly on the entire length of the tables. "Your job is to pick the red shit out of the beans so it doesn't get into the popsicles," she said. "The rats crawl into the beans and eat them. You must be alert because the red shit is similar in size, shape, and color to the beans." She surveyed the beans on the table and picked out a red bean and another particle that looked like the bean and held them up to us. "This is a bean," she said, showing us what she held in her right hand. "And this is red shit," she said, thrusting out her left hand. She threw the bean back on the table and dropped the red shit into an old tin can next to her on the floor. "The beans are a bit redder than the shit," she said, "so be careful. If you have doubts, keep in mind that they don't taste the same." After the shock of her words registered on our faces, she broke into a broad, toothless grin. "Just use your fingers. That should be enough." "Master worker Wang," one of the girls said, Are there gloves for us to wear?" "Gloves?" she snarled. "Aren't you supposed to rid of yourself of your bourgeois thinking? Do you see me wearing gloves?" She held up her bare hands. When there was no response, she left and closed the door behind us. That was it. We stood quietly at first, looking at one another. We could hardly believe that this is what Chairman Mao wanted us to learn, from workers, separating red sheet from beans with our bare hands. Xu Yuqing broke the silence finally and ordered, "Don't just stand there. Let's get started. We must do what Master Worker Wang tells us to do." She dipped her hand into the pile of beans and withdrew a fistful and began examining them. The rest of us began pulling through the beans, feeling for rat shit. Some of the girls were repelled by the exercise, but we had to do it. And we had to do it barehanded. "I know one thing for sure," I said after removing a dozen little balls of rat shit. "What's that?" Xu Yuqing asked. "What have you learned today, Comrade Wu?" "I've learned that I'm never, ever going to eat any popsicles, Comrade Xu." There were giggles around the table. We separated beans from shit for 4 weeks. Then we attended classes in math and chemistry and English for a short time. The level of instructions was elementary. In English class, we memorized mispronunciations of the alphabet. We were taught to wave our fists in the air and proclaim, "Lang li wu, qi men mao," "Long live Qianmen Mao," which we were absolutely convinced was "Long live Qianmen Mao" in perfect English. After a few weeks of this was decided, we had more to learn from workers. This time, we all marched off to a truck factory. I was assigned to work with a welder. She was a friendly woman with a very red, round face and an unusually musical voice. She greeted me with a smile. "Welcome," she said. "My name is Master Worker Jiang. You're a high school student, and no doubt you're a big intellectual in this humble factory. What are you doing here wasting your time? You should be studying." "Oh, I'm here to learn from you, Master Worker Jiang," I replied timidly. "You're supposed to teach me how to weld." She burst out laughing. "And what will you do after you learn how to weld?" she asked. "I don't know," I said. "What a waste," she grumbled. "Anyway, as long as you're here, follow me." She led me to her work area in the corner of a huge room. The odors from the chemicals she was working with were overpowering. My eyes watered, and sharp pains shot through my head. Master Worker Jiang, however, seemed oblivious to the smells. She held a metal mask in front of her face and welded a small spot on a piece of iron. "Put this on," she said, and handed me a mask. "Hold this with your left hand." She thrust a welder's gun into my hand. Then she had me weld a spot. It looked simple. She gave me a piece of scrap metal to practice on. I tried to do what she had done, but my work was uneven and messy. She laughed and said, "Ha, you're just a kid. You're too weak. You'll hurt yourself. You don't have to do anything. Just sit down over there. But aren't I supposed to do something? No, there's nothing you can do here, she said. The factory was organized on new theories called the no government theory and the iron rice bowl. As far as I could figure, this meant there were no bosses and nobody worked. I noticed that beneath her open overalls, Master Worker Jiang was wearing a colorful sweater. Embarrassed by inability to weld, I changed the subject and said, "That's a beautiful sweater." She smiled at my remark, and her eyes flashed. "I made it myself," she said. "Maybe there is something I can teach you. Bring some needles and yarn tomorrow, and I'll show you how to knit a sweater." The next morning, I brought knitting needles and yarn with me to the factory. Master Worker Jiang sat next to me on the short welding stool and patiently showed me how to create fancy stitches and designs and to put flowers into the material. Day after day, we sat together and knitted. She brought her own knitting and made a sweater for her husband. Now and then, she paused to do some welding, but only to make a wash basin stand for her home. Since it was a government factory and government material, she was stealing. I didn't say this, of course. I noticed when we left the factory in the evening that many of the older workers were taking articles home. A small fish tank, a table, a chair. They were slowly looting the factory. One afternoon, I was talking with a student who worked in another department of the factory. I stood next to a table and asked, "What are you doing there?" She smiled and held up a book and replied, "Reading. What do you do?" "I knit," I said. We talked for a time until I wandered back to my department to resume my knitting. I finished the sweater while we were in the factory, and my classmate was successful in getting a good deal of reading done. End of chapter 49.